Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Messianic Bible Study with me, Zeli. So, yes, last time we had a fun time talking about slavery. Now we're going to be talking about various laws and how they affect or how they are utilized in the nation of Israel, and ultimately how they are utilized in the law of God, which, I mean, I'm a Messianic. If you're a Messianic, then you take every single one of these seriously. And more than that, how these laws relate to morality. Because one thing that the early Christians did was they decided to split up the law into three parts. And they did this for a reason. It was because they assumed that obviously Jesus and Paul, they had abolished some of these laws. And so you take books like Galatians, you take Mark 7, you take Romans 7, 1 through 5, you take Hebrews, and pretty much anything after Hebrews 7. And if you're an early Christian and you are not reading these passages carefully, you're not having the proper presuppositions in play, then you're reading these and you're saying, oh, okay, so certain things are no longer required. And so if you're an early Christian, you're trying to figure out what the category of things that are no longer required are. And so they came up with three categories. And these were natural law, God's sort of spiritual law, the moral law, and then sort of the physical law. Now, if you are typically used to this tripartite, let's say, division of law, then you're going to be hearing what I just said, and you're going to say that's not the tripartite division. It's a different thing. And actually, I'm going to pause this really quick, and I'm just going to go and double check I got those correct. Okay, so I was a little off on that one. So he says, we must therefore distinguish three kinds of precepts in the old law, namely moral precepts, which are dictated by the natural law, ceremonial precepts, which are determinations of the divine worship, and judicial precepts, which are determinations of the justice to be maintained among men. Now, you might think that that is essentially the ceremonial, civil, and moral distinction, but it's not, because when we talk about the civil law, we're talking about the law the law that must be maintained in Israel. But that's not what he's talking about here, because when he talks about judicial precepts, these are all of the laws in the Bible that have to do with, or in the Old Testament, that have to do with two men. And it is an ordered society that dictates whether two men can do one thing or another thing towards each other. And then the moral law, that is natural law. And natural law is, when we think of moral law, we think of, I guess, universal laws. And that would fall probably under the same category as natural law being not only universal laws, but with the additional idea that they are they can be found in nature. Like, you can go to pretty much any civilization, whether they have the Bible or whether they don't have the Bible, and they can and you'll find these laws. That's what the natural law is. And then the ceremonial laws, these are all of the laws that have to do with man's relationship to God. And the judicial laws are all the laws that have to do with man's relationship to other men. When we say ceremonial today, oftentimes that just means temple laws, but that wouldn't be that's like one aspect of one characteristic of the ceremonial law that Thomas Aquinas talks about and that Augustine talks about. And then let's see, because pretty much anything that you find in the Old Testament where man is relating to God, that would be considered a ceremonial dictate or precept or commandment or whatever. The judicial laws, well, I've already gone into that. So it's slightly different. Not super different, but slightly different. And this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to think, okay, well, some laws are done away with, some laws are not done away with. So how do we determine which laws are done away with and which ones are not? And they came up with the idea that, okay, you have these three types of laws. Now, maybe one of those types are done away with. So you could say the judicial and the ceremonial laws. You can't do away with the moral laws, but Christians didn't agree, and I think Thomas Aquinas even doesn't really agree with that. I think he's a little more he takes a bit more of a scalpel to it, because you can't just say all the judicial laws are done away with, because what about theft? That's a judicial law. And so, I mean, he has a pretty large treatise on the law, but it seems that the way that he deals with judicial law is it is essentially contingent on certain things being in existence. So theft is contingent on people stealing. If nobody steals, if it's impossible to steal now, then the laws regarding theft are void. And so he would say that if let's say we can eat unclean animals now, this would be a ceremonial commandment. I think it'd be, well, that's a hard categorization, because does that fall into ceremonial or judicial? I don't think anybody could really figure that out. But that would be maybe one of those. And because Jesus declared all foods clean, now we can eat those foods. And that's sort of like the way he thinks about it, because it's a law that's contingent, and what it was contingent on is no longer in existence, so therefore the law is abolished. Natural law then would be sort of like universal laws. They cannot be abolished, and this would be the moral law. And so essentially, he's taking much more of a scalpel to it. If you were a Christian today and you were taking his same categories and applying them to our day, and you say that the civil and the ceremonial laws are done away with, then what you are left with is not a set of things that sound good to us. You're left with only the laws that are universal to men. So only the laws that you could figure out on your own. That's essentially what you're left with. And what that leaves you with is essentially making yourself in the place of God in terms of dictating morality. And that's why Thomas Aquinas, he doesn't actually follow that line of reasoning. He doesn't believe that. And by the way, neither did the reformers. They had a slightly different distinction. John Wesley had a slightly different tripartite law, but none of them believed that you could just, well, actually, John Wesley did, that you could just do away with any category of law. You had to sort of deal with the specifics. Now, this gets interesting because suppose you do away with some specific laws, like kosher foods or Sabbath laws or something. Nowhere in the New Testament does it do away with the laws regarding tzitzit. Nowhere in the New Testament does it do away with the laws regarding growing your beards or cutting your hair. That's not there. And so you have to appeal if you want to do away with the laws regarding tzitzit, you have to appeal to church tradition. Or regarding beards, you have to appeal to church tradition. Like, is it a sin to have a shaven beard? Well, is it a sin to take a razor to your face, to your beard? If you don't think it is a sin, then you're not appealing to the Bible. You're appealing to church tradition for that. And so you have to presuppose, let's say, the ability to add to the Bible, which gets dicey. Not only the ability to add to the Bible, but the ability for humans to take away from the Bible, which is even more dicey. But I think they're all mistaken. Every single law is a moral law. And I've said this before, but you can't say that God just arbitrarily gave people immoral laws or amoral laws. That's a weird God, I think, if you believe that. He does give contingent laws. Like, all the laws are contingent. I agree with that. But they're contingent, but they're also paradigmatic. And what that means is that each law produces a paradigm by which you live the rest of your life in. And this is where we get much more of like a Mishnaic view of the law, where the laws regarding paya, you have to leave the corners of your field ungleaned for the poor. Well, what does that mean? The paradigm is, in your productive life, you leave some for the poor. You're not so stringent with your money. You don't go back and gather up things that fell, because that's to be left for the poor. Grain that fell or stocks that fell or something. And what that means is that is a paradigm that you now apply to all the other industries in life. You don't just say, well, I'm not a farmer, so therefore the law doesn't apply to me. This is the Mishnaic view, and like it's also the Christian view, by the way, that you come up with ways to apply that law in other areas of your life. And the New Testament example that is probably the most obvious would be in 1 Corinthians something, where Paul says, God commanded the people not to muzzle an ox. And he says, does God care for oxen? No, but obviously this is to show that a worker merits his wages. And so therefore you should tithe to your pastor. That's what Paul says. Therefore so thou shalt not muzzle an ox means you should tithe to your pastor, because your pastor is symbolically that ox. This is what it means to have a paradigmatic law. Do not muzzle an ox means, in all the other areas of your life, if there's a worker, then you should pay him his due wages. And that includes, if there's a spiritual worker, then pay him his due wages. He has a right to it, you could say. That's what Paul says. And what you can do is, like, so you are obligated to pay them unless that person refuses or they waive that right, which is what Paul did. He took up offerings, but he didn't take it for himself. He took it so that he could bring it to Jerusalem and pay for sacrifices there. So let's get into it. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and in his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing of which one says, "This is it," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them both to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall accept the oath, and he shall not make restitution. But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner. If it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Oh, and by the way, that the passage is in Summa Theologica. It is in part 1 of the second part in the Great Books series by Britannica, and it's question 99, article 4, if you wanted to look that up and fact check me. So we have a lot of property laws here, and the reason for this is because God likes property. Men are differentiated. They're not an undifferentiated blob. And what that means is men have rights to property. Men have rights to property. And so if somebody usurps that right, or they abolish that right in another person, then they have to pay him back. Now, if this flies in the face of a lot of the feel-good hippie Marxist theories, where you think that, okay, property is bad in itself because property means inequality, and it does. Because if men have right to their property, let's say you just in these instances, two men have equal property rights and they have equal property. One man steals from another man, or one man borrows from another man, and a lion comes in and tears up that beast or whatever. Well, now all of a sudden they're unequal and they don't just share things in common. So God is saying that sharing things in common is wrong. Every person has his own property rights, and that's how it is. So if somebody steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep, and if a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. Now, this is an interesting one because this means that regardless of and this is at night. Well, actually, it doesn't really. It sort of implies that it's at night. Let's see. What's B here? Okay. It sort of implies that it's at night, but if the sun rises on him, could be an idiom, because it actually. Because this next part, he shall surely pay, is like, how can he pay if he's dead? I suppose the idea, the implication. Okay. So if I think I got it. If a thief is found breaking in and struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. And so what that means, of course, is if a thief breaks in, it's night, it's dark, you can't see anything, you don't know what his intentions are, and you kill him, then no blood guilt. And this is interesting because there is blood guilt for the avenger of blood, the redeemer. And there is blood guilt if a dead person is just found somewhere and a city doesn't wash their hands of it. Means their city has blood guilt on it. So there's a lot of, let's say, innocent situations where blood guilt is applied. And in fact, I think, yeah. So in this instance, it's exactly like when somebody is swinging an axe and he swings and the axe head falls off and goes and hits someone else in the head and kills them, meaning it's an act of God. There's no blood guilt for that. There is no blood guilt for this either, meaning if you're protecting your life, you think you're protecting your life, and you kill a person, then you're absolutely in the clear. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's what this is saying, because blood guilt is an interesting concept. It doesn't just mean they're guilty of some sort of crime. That's being guilty of some sort of crime implies blood guilt, but it doesn't mean you're guilty of a crime. Blood guilt is a bit more of a spiritual concept. It means that death has attached itself to you, so to speak. Like Cain and Abel, his blood cries out from the ground. It's calling you to witness, or it's witnessing against you. And so there's this death that has occurred that's attaching itself to you to witness against you, so against God, or to witness against you before God. And that's really sort of what blood guilt is. Think of it like, and this is not exactly the best concept, but somebody kills somebody and they're haunted by the ghosts of that person. That's kind of what it is, except more before God. In Revelation. the people under the altar, they cry out to God who have been beheaded, and they say, how long will you leave us unavenged? That's blood guilt, which also means that it continues in the New Testament. But if the sun is risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. So what that means is you're not supposed to kill him if he's not trying to kill you. If the sun is risen, which means you can differentiate between white and green, that's the rabbinic way to determine whether or not the sun is risen. If you're able to distinguish between two similar colors, or white, which is not similar to green, so like two colors that are disparate, then you're not supposed to kill him because you're able to distinguish whether or not he has a weapon. So you don't kill him unless he does have a weapon, then you can. Instead, he shall surely pay. So he's trying to steal something. You don't kill him. You you're a witness to the event, and he shall surely pay. So instead of killing him, he just pays you a bunch of money. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. Now, this is the penal slavery, what I was talking about before. And that's an interesting thing, because he shall be sold for his theft is not saying, oh, this is such a horrible society, and God is sort of like lifting the Israelites one step towards justice away from the pagan darkness that they once were in. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is, in order for him to pay his due, it is good for him to be sold into slavery. It's not that this is because of the hardness of your hearts that this is happening, but it's that it is a good thing. This is just a good, it's a just thing. Because what's the alternative? First of all, you give him a fine. So you just give him a huge fine and have him pay back the debt. And if he cannot, what do? Throw him in prison? Well, you just put him in slavery anyway. Except the difference is now he's not going to pay the guy anything. The guy doesn't get anything. You stole something from him, and now you just get nothing out of it. He goes to prison, sure, okay, great, but where's the justice in that? So what God is saying is that's our system now is actually wrong. If he still steals something, he shall be fined, and it's a good thing for him to be sold so that he can work to pay it off. And of course, this would all be under the supervision of a judge who would allot the number of years to help this person produce on his field and in his land, and to gain the skills to do this, which would then allow him to have some sort of positive skill when he gets out of slavery. So he would probably be a slave. Let's say he steals $10 or something. He shall pay $20, which means he's probably going to be a slave for like a week or something like that, depending on what the judge determines. But the maximum punishment is slavery for 7 years. And then we've already talked about all of this last week. If he is sold into slavery and the man just goes crazy and beats him, then then he pays restitution for that. Like, he can't just beat his slaves. And so there's a lot of protection under the biblical law for this sort of thing, and it protects the people who have been stolen from. It's a just thing. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So if he stole an ox, then he gives 2 oxes back. Now that one's actually, I think you could probably interpret that two ways. Either he gives the ox plus another one back, or he gives the ox and then gives two more oxes. It's probably left to interpretation, and I'm sure the rabbis have figured it out, but I have not read that section in the Mishnah. So, if a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the beast, from the best in his own field and in his own vineyard. Now, so far, we're talking about a lot of judicial laws here, except for this blood guilt one, which is a ceremonial law. How do we know? Because it's between God and man, man and God. Because blood guilt is a man and God thing. It's the man crying out for God as witness. But it's also a judicial law because it happened because two men fought and one man died. So this is why it's muddy and you can't parse it out. Plus, and this is something I forgot to mention before, when you're talking about this tripartite division of law, and then you try to superimpose that onto the New Testament and what they're writing, it just doesn't make any sense. The reason is because in the same context, let's say in Galatians or Romans, Paul will be like, yeah, the law is really good and you should keep it. And then also the next line or the next chapter, but this law is also wrong. And you're like, oh, well, which law is he talking about? The law of sin and death? That's not the law of ceremonies or the law of judiciaries or whatever. So it's and then he'll be like, okay, this law is good, this law is good, do not keep this law is good, but he doesn't distinguish between them. He just says the law over and over again. And so you're like, oh, well, the law is good, the law is good, the law is bad, the law is good, the law is good, don't keep the law is good, and all that sort of stuff. He doesn't say the ceremonial law is bad. He doesn't say the moral law is good. That's just not found anywhere in the New Testament. And so to make that distinction is to superimpose not only a theory that is not found in the New Testament, but a theory that does not work if you try to apply it to the context of Scripture. Like if you try to apply it to the context of Romans, Paul just says the law over and over again. And you can sort of make some sort of distinctions, but it's not the same distinctions that are being made. And so the same thing if you read Galatians or if you read Hebrews, the distinction that's being made is not the same one that the early Christians made or the Christians today are making, which makes it a nonsensical distinction because it's just made up at that point. Okay. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and in his own vineyard. Makes sense? This is if he is just negligent, then he pays back. If he willfully, so this is going back to free will again. If he willfully takes from another man, then he shall pay 5 or 4 times or 3 times the amount back. If he lets the animal loose and it's an act of God, so to speak, but you know that there's a probability that the animal will feed either in your field or someone else's field, then you don't pay 4 times, you just pay what the animal ate. If a fire breaks out and catches in thorns that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. So if you're camping, start a fire, then it gets out of hand, and then it goes and destroys some of the crops in your neighbor's field, then you make restitution. Again, that's restoring something because of negligence, not restoring something because you willfully stole something directly. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing of which one says, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. So again, If he stole something, then he pays double. If he does not steal something, then he does not. And this one actually is interesting because it's sort of continued. If a man gives, so this is the general law, this is the prescription, and then you have a couple descriptive laws or nuances. First of all, they come near to God. So is this a ceremonial law or a judicial law? They're coming near to God. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to do the Urim and the Thummim. Whoever the Urim falls on is the one who has to pay. So, and they're casting lots essentially, but God directed lots. So, what is that? Ceremonial because you're coming to the temple to do this? Or is it judicial because it's between two men? It's a bit of both. Or is it moral? Because if you steal something, it said do not steal. So therefore give back what you stole. It's all three. So if the thief is found, then the thief pays. And the thief shall pay double. The thief pays, and also the owner of the house is exempt from payment. And then it goes in all of this they shall pay double, but they bring the case before God. Both parties shall come before God, and the one who God condemns, the one who does who the Urim falls on, shall pay double to his neighbor. However, if a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, so like there's no witnesses, and they don't find a thief, and there's no Urim and Thummim lot falling, then an oath by the Lord shall be between the both of them to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. Now, this is interesting because if you read like the Code of Hammurabi, the oath to the Lord is found in a lot more instances. It's like, if this happens, then they shall have an oath to the Lord. If this happens, they shall have an oath to the Lord. And it really feels like an exemption from the law if you just hold your hand up. But here it's different because the Urim and the Thummim have been used. And now, and God has said that neither of them are guilty. So he swears an oath to the Lord, and he is entirely exempt from paying anything. He shall not make restitution. But if it turns out that it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution. So, in other words, if no one knows what happened to this beast that has been borrowed, then they make an oath and they do the Urim and the Thummim. If there is evidence for what happens, then you bring the evidence. This is torn by beast. Obviously, these are the claw marks. So that's the evidence here. And if it is not due to if the beast being taken from the other guy and his property being or his property rights being abolished in this instance, and it's not the one who borrowed its fault, he doesn't pay anything because it's not his fault. It is entirely an act of God. And again, we get that same discussion with the Calvinists. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. So if the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. So in other words, if this is just breaking it down a bit more, if something happens and the owner is there, then the owner is responsible for it because the owner is there. He's protecting it. He's protecting his own property. If the owner's not with it, well, now the blame goes to, or the guilt, so to speak, goes to the one who borrowed it. And then if it was hired, of course, he already paid for it. So in all the other instances, this was if the person, it's like leasing a car. If you borrow a car from a friend and it gets stolen, broken into, or you drive it away and you don't give it back, well, then the judge will come and say, pay back 2 times the car that you stole if you stole it. If you didn't steal it and you parked it in front of your house and some thief came in and they broke into it and drove it away, then you're exempt from paying because God has determined by the Urim and the Thummim and by the oath that you swear that it was not your fault. If, however, you have leased it from the owner, then you've already paid him for it. That's sort of what this is saying. Which is interesting because at that point, like this is assuming that you have stolen it, because that's the only instance when you would be paying for something that is lost from your neighbor. So if you steal something that you lease, well, you pay what the contract has, which is, well, nowadays that would just be whatever is in the contract. So like if you steal something, then the contract will stipulate how much you owe if you steal it, which would be a lot of money. Working in construction, you rent tools sometimes, and they'll say, well, if you just don't bring it back, then you're paying every day this amount, and you pay that for 90 days. And if you don't bring it back in 90 days, then it's yours. Legally, it's all yours now. But the big difference here is if you do it that way, as opposed to just buying the tool, you're paying 10 times more. So that's sort of how God is seeing this justice here. If you just drive away with it, well, then, whatever the judges have determined the car is worth, whatever you ought to have bought that car for, that's what you're paying. Of course, this is talking about oxes and stuff like that. Now, interesting ones. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. Okay, so a lot of times this verse here is translated, if a man, how is it translated? It implies rape, but the problem, if a man seizes her, if a man seizes a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, a girl of marriageable age. Okay. But the word there is a bit of an interesting word. The problem with the interpretation of rape in terms of the seizing is all sexual acts outside of marriage are degrading to a woman. And that's just a fact. Even today, all sexual acts outside of marriage are degrading to a woman. So if you sleep with a woman, you have degraded her. And so what God is saying is if you're the one who has done this, then you're going to marry her. And so when it says like you're seizing this woman, or it definitely is better translated today as seducing this woman. But if you are degrading her in any sort of way through a sexual act, and this is in the instance where she is where she has consented to this, then even if she's consented, you've degraded her. And so therefore, if a man seduces a virgin, if he has degraded her, even though she is consented, who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her. So he's bound to marry her, and he shall make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. So in other words, you're not getting out of it. Even if the father says no, then the judge will still say, well, pay him the money then. And the bride price is
I'm going to make sure I get this right in my head, because there are two things: the bride price and then something else. The bride price is for the woman's protection. You're not just buying a woman. The father doesn't get to do whatever he wants with that, but he keeps that bride price for if anything happens to you and you disappear for some reason. And that bride price will go to her to help her to be remain on her feet. So that's what the bride price is. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Is that a ceremonial law? Is that a judicial law? That seems like a judicial law, but it's also a ceremonial law, because a sorceress, that's somebody who turns you away from God. But it's also a moral law, because you're not supposed to turn away from God, because moral laws are so it's all three. And if you're worried about not permitting sorceresses to live, well, it's probably because you never met one. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Okay. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Naturally. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and your children fatherless. So, yeah, laws about social justice. This is the extent of social justice, by the way. Do not wrong or oppress those who are weak or don't have the, let's say, social backing that you might expect. If somebody doesn't have the social privileges of being raised in a normal household, or growing up in the particular culture that you are familiar with, and they just are like, they're unfamiliar with the customs, or if somebody doesn't have their father protecting them, or a woman does not have her husband protecting him, and they're sort of in that lower class of people, quote unquote lower class. But what God is saying is, even though they may not have the resources to protect themselves, I will protect them. It might be worse for you if you oppress those people as opposed to somebody who can fight you. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. That's what they say. That's what he says, what God says. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. So there's another version of this verse somewhere else, and it says, if you lend to your brothers. And this is why in Judaism, if you lend to another Jew, then you can't lend with interest. And why a lot of Christian nations, actually Catholicism, it's the same thing. If you lend to another Catholic, you can't lend with interest. But it's interesting because the wording here is specifically if you're lending to a poor person, but it's like, who is borrowing money who's not poor? Well, actually, it turns out a lot of people borrow money who are not poor, because there's an investment strategy for borrowing money called good debt, and I don't understand it, but rich people also borrow. And so you can lend with interest to, according to this verse here, and we'll have to examine the other versions of this law when we get to them. But according to this version, if you lend to a wealthy person, then you can lend with interest. If you lend to a poor person who is a person of God, a Jew or a Christian, then you shall not act like a money lender to them. You shall not lend with interest. Now, the way that this ends up practically is when the Christians decided to outlaw interest, nobody lended to anybody. And who this hurt the most was poor people, because rich people sort of have the resources to, like, even if they don't get money lent to them, they sort of have the resources to continue going. Now, it might put them in a slightly more difficult situation, but they'll survive. Poor people need money, and they need to have money lent to them. And so one of the best ways for a poor person to actually either get up on their feet or to climb the social ladder and hierarchy is if they're able to receive loans. Like, okay, and a very clear instance, rich person has $20,000 set aside just in his bank, or he can sell something and get that pretty easily. He needs a new car. Okay, done. He has a new car. Poor person, he needs a new car. How is he gonna get a new car? Well, you could lend him money for a car or lend him a car, but if you're not going to lend him with interest, if you're not going to get anything out of that deal, then why would you do that? Because there's a severe liability. So the poor person needs a loan, unless he's just going to walk to work. And of course, back in this day, in Moses' day, you walked to work. That's pretty much what you did. But the way that God actually solves this problem, because he recognizes that this is a problem, and the heart is desperately wicked. He just says, if a poor person is poor and asks for money, just give it to him. And so, like, if a poor person is so the way that God actually solves this problem is, yeah, you can lend money to a poor person, and ask him to give it back, or bind him to a contract or whatever, but you can't lend with interest. Now, if a poor person just asks for money, well, and at that point you just have to give it to him, and not only give it to him, but you have to give it generously to him. And that's what the Bible says. So what the rabbis did is they had in order to be a beggar, you had to have and I say rabbis, but when we're talking about the Mishnah, we're actually talking about the rulings from the Sanhedrin. So it's not really the same, but also the rabbis. But if you were a beggar, you actually had to have a specific badge to be a beggar. You had to have begging privileges, because of these laws. If you have the law that you have to give to anybody who is a beggar, then you can't have every poor person being a beggar. If they are able to pay back a loan, then that's what you do. You give them a loan. But if they have a special badge given by the judges saying that they just literally can't work, they literally have no resources or ability to pay back anything that is given to them, then you still have to give to them. And that's sort of how God got around the wicked hearts of men who do not lend so long as there won't be any return for them. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, so this is if you lend something to somebody and you take a pledge, a surety, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. So that's another thing. If you're taking an essential, and another version of this passage or of this verse, another version of this law includes like millstones. So the person's essential money-making property, or food-producing property, or the stuff that's directly on his food. In other words, you can't take a person's essentials as surety. You can take like other non-essential items from a person as a surety, and then if they just don't pay you back your loan, pay back their loan, then you get to keep that, but you can't keep something that is essential for them. And then the millstone example is you can't take something as surety from them that they need in order to pay you back and just make them a permanent debt slave or something. But then there's that too. If they don't pay you back, then they get sold into slavery. So, there's like God has thought about these things from all angles. Don't worry. If you lend to somebody, you're going to get your money back. Don't worry about it. You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. Oh, wait. Yeah. You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. This one is interesting because this is combining all authority into one. Do not revile God, who is the highest authority, but also do not curse any person who God has placed in authority over you. This gets interpreted in Acts 23 to include the wicked high priest that commands Paul to be smitten, who is an unbeliever, and he is actively working against the church. You can't curse that guy either. That's what Paul says. And that guy is a ruler of your people. That's also what Paul says. So, yeah, that's what that extends to. Pray for them, do not curse them. That's the difference. But also, they're still a ruler of your people. And that's interesting because if the ceremonial laws are done away with, then how is a wicked priest, unbelieving and actively working against the church, how is he a ruler of your people if the ceremonial laws are done away with? He wouldn't be. If Jesus has usurped the priesthood, then he's not a priest anymore. But you see, that's not how God sees it. That's not how the Bible sees it or how Paul sees it. That guy's still a ruler. He's still a priest. He's still a ruler of your people. And the temple and the temple service and the sacrifices are still maintained because there is no ceremonial law that is not also moral. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. Firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. And what this means is you're not literally sacrificing the firstborn of your sons, but that is to say, you shall redeem the firstborn of your sons, as we've seen from other passages already, and we'll see from other passages yet to come. You shall do the same with your oxen and your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And so on the 8th day, the firstborn of your son gets circumcised and gets redeemed. And we saw Jesus' parents do this, for instance. And if it's a kosher animal, then you give it as a burnt offering. You shall be consecrated to me, therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Yeah, so, don't eat unclean foods. And that's one of the unclean foods is, but the sojourner does get to eat that sort of thing. So that's an interesting one. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this, please comment. If you have not enjoyed this, also please comment because I would love to hear from you. It's morning for me, by the way. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If not, please also like and subscribe. I can make you upset and mad more or whatever. Anyway, have a good day. And yeah, have a good day.